Okay, thank you all so much for coming in to this webinar this morning to hear a little bit about some of the incredible policy challenges facing Ohio. I'm Amy Henauer, and I'm the Director of Policy Matters Ohio, and we create a more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Ohio by doing research, supporting coalitions, and working directly with policymakers like you. And we're really grateful to you all for running for office and to wanting to be part of the leadership of this state and confront some of the things that challenge us. Um, we fight for policy solutions that we think will keep Ohio healthy, that will strengthen our economy, and that will revitalize our communities. And increasingly, we're realizing that all of those things really are interconnected, that if people earn enough money to get by, they experience less stress and can stay healthier, that if children are in great early childcare and education, their parents can work and better support the family, and that those kids will enter school more ready to learn. And that if the state can invest in work supports or green energy, it can create jobs and keep communities more vibrant and healthy. So we know that you share our goals of kind of addressing those problems in Ohio. So we pulled some of our top researchers onto this call, but we do have many others on staff with expertise in other issues, and we really encourage you to reach out to any of us at any time. We are all happy to take questions and calls from policymakers and aspiring policymakers. Rob Moore does budget and childcare research out of our Columbus office. Amanda Woodrum does research on health equity and the environment out of our Cleveland office up here. Mike Shields is an expert on manufacturing and good jobs up here in our Cleveland office. And we have a lot of the rest of a great team too. Daniel Ortiz leading outreach, and several others pictured here who you might have a little less interaction with because they do communications and fundraising for us. So please reach out to any of us at any time. We did just a few logistical details. We did send an email describing how to ask questions. You should be able to find a chat box by looking at the toolbar at the top. It's a black toolbar. It says mute on the far left and it says more on the far right. If you click on the word more at the top of that toolbar, you will, a drop down will appear, and the first option under that drop down will be chat. Click on that and a box should open and you can address a question to everyone. And we will take a look at those questions, and we'll probably take on most of those questions after the formal presentations. But if there's something that you want to ask at any time, those will be accumulating there. And if I look at it and see that it needs a more immediate answer, we'll try to get to that while folks are talking. So go ahead and type your questions into the chat box as soon as they occur to you, and that will get us kind of a good queue of questions for the Q&A period when we get to it. If you have any trouble at all, just go ahead and email Daniel Ortiz, D-Ortiz, D-O-R-T-I-Z at policymattersohio.org, no dashes, no dots. Or anyone else on staff will get back to you after the call, but if you email Daniel during the call, we'll try to get back to you. We are recording this, so please be aware of that. And we are a nonpartisan organization, and there are Republicans and Democratic candidates on this call, so we're so glad to have all of you here. Thank you very much, and let's get started with our project director out of our Columbus office, Kalitha Williams, who specializes in asset building, helping families to build the wealth that they need to get by.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So asset building is an anti-poverty strategy that focuses on lifting people into financial stability by helping them save, protect, and grow their assets. When most of us hear the word assets, we typically think of a house or a car, but assets include other things that support and sustain a family's financial health. That could be access to employer-based health insurance, the ability to use traditional bank services and not relying on exploitative financial products like payday loans, and include taking advantage of educational opportunities like certifications and training that help increase our workers' income. Next slide. Prosperity Now, a national organization focused on economic opportunity for low-income families, annually measures and ranks states to determine which have a core set of policies and outcomes that support the financial stability and viability of its citizens. Over the past few years, Ohio has ranked in the bottom third of other states. For example, nearly 40% of Ohio households are liquid asset poor, meaning they do not have enough cash savings to cover basic expenses for 3 months if they experience a sudden job loss, a medical emergency, or another financial crisis. Another includes that 1 in 5 Ohio households are unbanked or underbanked, such that they do not have a bank account, or if they do have an account, they still have to rely on financial services like subprime loans. The lack of strong policies make Ohioans vulnerable for financial vulnerability. Next slide. One policy where Ohio is behind the nation is helping low-income working families is the Earned Income Tax Credit. The EITC is the nation's most powerful anti-poverty program. In 2017, it lifted nearly 6 million Americans out of poverty. This credit is targeted in that it can only go to families with at least one worker. It also helps reduce tax inequality, because lower income families use more of their income paying taxes, like sales tax. Families that qualify for refunds use them to take care of their basic needs, like food, housing, transportation, and childcare. Last year, nearly 1 million Ohioans claimed the credit and received over $2 billion in refunds, which gave a boost to local economies. Next slide. 30 states, including the District of Columbia, have their own Earned Income Tax credits. But Ohio is one of only 6 without a refundable credit. Due to this and other flaws, only about 3% of Ohio's lowest income workers receive any benefit from the credit. Our state EITC lags behind the nation. Ohio should join the US and the majority of other states and implement a refundable EITC. Ohioans need policies like the refundable EITC that help them save, protect, and grow their assets. Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from Victoria Jackson, who is up here in our Cleveland office and is an expert in education and food aid and higher education. And take it away, Victoria.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning. I'll be covering state funding for K-12 education and higher education. There are 610 school districts in Ohio which educate the overwhelming majority of children. Despite the importance of public K-12 education, state policymakers have been underinvesting in education. For the 2018-2019 budget that passed in the summer of 2017, state policymakers increased K-12 funding by only 2.7% over the last 2-year budget. When adjusted for inflation, the state is actually investing less in state aid for school districts than it did in 2016. The graph on the screen shows aid from 2016 to 2019 adjusted for inflation. The green line is not adjusted and the navy line is adjusted for inflation. As you can see, in 2019, the end of our current budget, funding is less than in 2016. In the 2018-2019 budget, the majority of districts are flat funded or have their funding cut. 6 districts lose more than a third of their funding. The majority of state funding for school districts comes from foundation funding, which is based on a formula that considers a district's ability to raise local revenue for education and student demographics. The funding formula determines how much state aid is allocated to different districts. School districts are also harmed by school privatization that reduces aid for traditional public schools. School districts are harmed by charter schools and vouchers, which siphon public money away from districts and produce similar or worse outcomes for students. Charter schools are publicly funded, privately run schools often managed by for-profit corporations. Charter schools drain nearly $1 billion a year from school districts. Charter schools in Ohio have been plagued by mismanagement and fraud. A very prominent example is ECOT, the Electronic Classroom of Tomorrow, which has defrauded the state of at least $80 million, but there have been many others. Ohio's charter school industry is less regulated than many other states, in part because the state allows non-government entities to sponsor schools and allows them to be managed by for-profit companies. Statewide, most charter schools do not perform better than traditional public schools. Vouchers are money that the state gives to private schools to educate students who would have otherwise gone to their local public school. Ohio has 5 voucher programs, which cost $236 million in 2016. Lawmakers have increased funding and expanded the number of students who can participate in voucher programs by reducing eligibility requirements and adding new programs. The expansion has occurred despite an evaluation of Ohio's largest voucher program, the Educational Choice Program, which shows that even though voucher students who attend private schools tend to be better off financially than their peers in public schools, they have worse math and English scores. There are several things policymakers can do to improve education in Ohio. One of the most important is increasing funding for traditional public schools and directing more state aid to students who need more funding and ensuring that money for public schools not siphoned away by charters and vouchers. These things can be achieved by making changes to the funding formula. Changes like increasing the base per pupil amount and increasing funding in areas of the formula that target aid to low-income students, low-wealth districts, and students that need additional support. Next slide, please. I'm now going to transition to talking about higher education. Public higher education educates the vast majority of Ohio's college students. Despite this, policymakers have underinvested in public colleges and students are paying the price. Adjusted for inflation, funding for public colleges and universities is lower than right after the recession. The graph on the screen shows funding for public colleges from 2008 to 2019. The green line is adjusted for inflation and the navy line is not adjusted for inflation. As you can see, the funding in 2019 is lower than the funding after the recession. An analysis by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities found that in 2017, adjusted for inflation, Ohio spent 15% less, or a little over $1,000 fewer per college student than in 2008. The underinvestment contributes to Ohio being ranked 45th least affordable for college. This is based on the large percentage of family income that is required to pay for 1 year of college. The high cost of college hampers completion. Students cite working long hours to afford college and the general high cost of college as top reasons why they don't complete their degrees. The state of Ohio has committed to a goal of 65% college attainment by 2025. Currently, Ohio's attainment rate is 44.1%. To reach this goal, we need to bring in people who have traditionally been left out of accessing higher education and having a harder time to complete. Typically low-income students and non-traditional students, those who may be working full-time or have children. To ensure Ohio has a public higher education system that is accessible to all and supports degree completion, lawmakers need to invest in public higher education so low-income and middle-income people can afford higher education. To do this, we need more funding for colleges, and we need funding that specifically is targeted to supporting resources to help students complete their degrees. Next slide, please. The Ohio College Opportunity Grant is the state's only need-based aid for students. Since the recession, the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, also known as OCOG, has been severely underfunded. The graph on the screen shows OCOG funding from 2006 to 2019. As you can see, there's a severe drop-off around the 2019 mark. For 2019, OCOG has funded $101 million, which is $122 million below its peak. Initially, lawmakers intended to fund OCOG at $250 million per year. But we are far below that level now, and that's not adjusted for inflation. One of the biggest problems with OCOG is that most community college students are not able to receive the grant. During the recession, lawmakers made changes to the way OCOG is allocated, and that has left out community college students. However, the state does allow students at for-profit colleges who have worse academic outcomes, job placement, and student loan outcomes than community colleges to receive OCOG. In the 2018-2019 budget, policymakers earmarked nearly $11 million in OCOG for for-profit students. By allowing OCOG to be used at for-profit colleges, it encourages students to choose a riskier option for higher education. Policymakers should reinstate OCOG for community college students, prohibit for-profit colleges from receiving OCOG, and increase need-based aid levels beyond pre-recession levels so it is better able to cover the full cost of college for low-income students. Currently, policymakers are underinvesting in education at every level. Public higher education is the backbone of our communities and keeps our economy strong. It prepares children for higher education, the workforce, and civic life. And Ohio's public colleges educate our community's teachers, EMTs, social workers, lawyers, welders, and doctors. Ohio needs to robustly fund education to ensure our communities are strong. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. It's really daunting to think that at a time when a lot of employers are saying they need more educated workers, we are investing less in all of these levels of education. So I really appreciate that presentation. And if folks have questions about education while they're fresh in your mind, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We won't get to them until the Q&A, but if you jot them down now, they might, you might have what Victoria said fresh in your mind. And Hannah is our project director in Columbus, primarily focusing on workforce issues. So she's the one who's often fielding the claims that employers need more educated workers. And Hannah, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the workplaces?
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to give a quick tour of some of the challenges that our team is looking at here in the Ohio economy and give you a couple of policy recommendations on how we can turn those challenges into greater opportunity for more Ohioans. Slide, please. So if we just look at the top line stats for Ohio, we look pretty good. I mean, July's job numbers, we see that the state's regained all the jobs that we lost to the 2007 recession, and we finally closed the jobs gap. So that's the number that we lost plus the number that we would need to keep up with population over that time. So that's good news for Ohio. Ohio's added 198,000 jobs over the course of recovery, and our unemployment rate has been below 5% for about 10 months. Again, this is good news for the state, but in spite of this, many Ohioans are no better off for it. All boats aren't being lifted, and this is showing up in lots of places, but I want to talk about two of them quickly. First, our labor force. That's the number looking for work or actually working here in Ohio. That's still below 2007 recession levels. So our 4.6 unemployment rate feels a whole lot different than it did in earlier periods of expansion. So let me give you an example of this. In April, we hit 4.3% unemployment. The last time we were floating around these numbers was July of 2001 at 4.2%. In 2001, again, a similar rate, but we had 27,000 more people in our labor force and 33,000 more people working with 6,000 fewer unemployed people. So even though we have this low rate of unemployment, there's still some slack going on in our labor market, just because a lot of folks are not in the labor force and are not being picked up by that official unemployment rate. So we are missing about 183,000 folks since 2007. Slide, please. The other place that this is showing up is in our poverty rates. Poverty rates have been very slow to fall over the course of our recovery. Again, this is despite job growth. This is despite educational gains among our workforce. So in 2016, the last year that we have data for, our rate was 14.6%. The year before the recession, we were at 13.1%, not great, but better than 14. And in 2001, it was 11.9. Again, back when we had similar levels of low unemployment, we were doing much better off in terms of our poverty rate. So lots of Ohioans are working, they're not getting ahead. And nationally, real wage data has fallen over the year, particularly for production and non-supervisory employees. And so it looks like we're actually moving in the wrong direction despite this job growth. Next slide, please. And that's a big question that policy folks and even our special summer associate here, Ernie, has been trying to tackle. Demand is outpacing supply, then why aren't we seeing price growth? And this is a question that's particularly important to groups that are disproportionately helped in a tight labor market, right? That would be women, Black workers, groups that face implicit or explicit bias in the workplace. They do much better whenever there's a tight labor market, but it doesn't look like that's translating into worker gains. Forbes, that bastion of progressive thinking, has posited two explanations for this conundrum. One is the one we just covered, labor force slack, that there's lots of folks not being picked up in the official unemployment rate. But the second is that, and this is from a Forbes article, not my words, that labor lost and capital won. By this, they mean there's insufficient worker bargaining power across the labor market. And working people can't exert pressure to drive up those prices. And so this can be seen in big ways and in small ways, such as non-compete agreements being placed on workers in frontline fast food service, that there's just nowhere else to go. Next slide, please. And this is what it looks like here in Ohio in terms of occupations. This is, you can see a comparison between the occupations back in 2000 and 2017. These are the largest occupation categories by employment over that time. And you can see in 2017, 6 out of the 10 largest occupation categories paid a typical worker so little that if they had a family of 3 to support, they would still be eligible for food assistance. That's not the case 2 decades ago. And you can also see that many of these occupations are the same as they were almost 2 decades ago in 2000. They're just doing a little worse off in 2017. So they've moved in the wrong direction. So what's to be done about this? Market forces and the current set of policies that are shaping the market just do not appear to be improving the lives of the majority of working people in this state. We're just not able to generate shared prosperity, even in times of job growth, even in times of increasing productivity. So that's a primary question that the work team looks at, and we have some suggestions on that. So first, increasing the minimum wage, $15 an hour by 2025 would have a direct impact on the occupations that you see listed on the board. Currently, a family of 3 with a minimum wage breadwinner that's working full-time year-round would be earning $3,000 below the poverty rate. So that's one way to reverse some of these trends. Next slide, please. A second way is to really directly impact the bargaining power question is by building and supporting unions and protecting collective bargaining. Here you see how unions can raise wages across a broad section of workers. Next slide. And similar to raising the minimum wage, we should restore the 40-hour work week by raising the overtime threshold for some salaried workers. Currently, that's set at $23,660. If we raise it to $47,476, that would boost the incomes of hundreds of thousands of Ohio workers. This is a rule that should have been implemented in October, but was quashed by the new administration. Ohioans are losing about $123,000 in wages every day because we have failed to raise this threshold. This would, again, directly target those workers in those big categories of occupations that are just not able to gain traction in this economy. We're talking about shift supervisors, fast food and retail managers, people who make very little but are on salary and often end up working well over 40 hours a week. They just don't get paid for it. Next slide. So if you're interested in our work on this and you want more details about any of these policies, we've captured 10 of them in our report, A New Way Forward. That's available on our website. We also produced a report with Innovation Ohio. This is the first co-produced report with them. It's called A Winning Economic Agenda for Ohio's Working Families. That's also available online. If you Google it, it'll come right up. That includes our work and wages policy, but also policies on higher education, workforce development, tax and budget, just a broad swath, a big platform on ways we can sort of reverse these trends and have policies that support a more fair, more inclusive labor market. And then finally, if you're really into data and you want updated figures on what's going on broadly in the Ohio economy, Amy will be releasing our State of Working Ohio report on Labor Day. We are, I think Amy was called the Labor Day Grinch because of this report. But, it tells the truth about where we are in the state and some of those challenges, so look out for that. All of this is on our website. If you have trouble finding it, you can always email me or call me, and I welcome questions, welcome, further one-on-ones, deep dives into this information. And again, thanks for joining us and learning about all of our work.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was great. And I see the questions are starting to pour in, which is terrific. If you have questions about the labor market or about jobs, about overtime, about the minimum wage, let's go ahead and throw those into the chat box so we can be ready to answer those in the Q&A. And I neglected to say, after Kalitha spoke, she mentioned the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the most powerful tools we have for fighting poverty among working families. She mentioned some other aspects of exploitative financial products. So if you have questions about those things, if you can remember back all the way back to the beginning of this call and Kalitha's presentation, please go ahead and get those into the chat box. And I just want to now welcome Wendy Patton, who is our tireless Senior Project Director in Columbus, looking at all things budget. And Wendy, please take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Our first slide here shows a portrait of Ohio's 2018-2019 all funds budget and a few others as well. The 2018-2019 all funds budget, which includes taxpayer dollars in the general revenue fund, fees and assessments for particular uses in special purpose funds and federal funds, totaled about $133 billion. It's a biennial budget, a 2-year budget. So that's about $66 billion in 2018 and $67 billion in 2019. Of that $133 billion, the state source funds like taxpayer dollars and lottery profits that are deposited in the general revenue fund accounted for about $45.5 billion, or 34%, just over a third of the total. We'll come back to this because it is the General Revenue Fund, or the GRF, where state lawmakers establish priorities and they fight out the budget battles. This is the core of state budget analysis. A couple of baseline points first. Many of you know this. I'm going to go over it quickly. Number one, remember how I said that just about a third of the all funds budget is made up of state source dollars in the GRF. The bar chart on this slide shows the state dollars in GRF in green compared to the balance, that's the Navy. The other 2/3 of the all funds operating budget are made up of federal and special purpose funds. About 37% is federal, and the balance is the dedicated purpose or special purpose funds. Number two, I already mentioned, Ohio has a 2-year budget called a biennial budget. Lawmakers make up a new one every 2 years. Number three, the state budget year, referred to as the fiscal year, runs from July 1st to June 30th. Not all public entities have the same calendar. Most local governments, for example, do their budgets on a calendar year basis. The federal government's fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. Not the state. When we refer to years here, both with regards to the budget, expenditures, and taxes, we're referring to the state fiscal year, July 1st to June 30th. Most of you know this baseline information, but some welcomed refreshers, so I'll make one more point. State agencies run many internal budgets, but across all of state government, there are 5 main budgets, and we show them here on this first slide. There's the main operating budget, which I've described here, and that's the big bar. The other budgets are quite small in comparison. There's the transportation budget, which allocates federal and special purpose funding for highways and bridges and public safety, and even a little for public transit. There is a separate budget for the Bureau of Workers' Compensation, about $600 million over a 2-year period, and a budget for the Industrial Commission, which provides oversight to the Bureau of Workers' Compensation, about $700 million during the biennial budget period. And then there is a capital budget, about $2.65 billion. The first 4 operating budgets mentioned here start in an even year, like 2018, the operating budget. The capital budget, however, commences in odd-numbered fiscal years. Next slide, please. This slide focuses in on the most interesting part of the state budget, the General Revenue Fund. We focus on the General Revenue Fund because that's where the taxpayer dollars are spent, but it's complicated. Ohio is one of just a handful of states that put some federal dollars into the General Revenue Fund. We put Medicaid dollars there. So if you look at the pie chart on the right side of this slide, this pie chart shows General Revenue Funds, including federal Medicaid dollars. You'll see that when you look at it from that perspective, Health and Human Services make up half of the General Revenue Fund, with Medicaid the biggest part. And again, this reflects the federal dollars that Ohio plunks down into the GRF, about $10 billion a year, or $20 billion over the course of the biennium. If you look at the pie chart on the left side of the screen, you see a clearer picture of how Ohio's state source funds are used. Primary and secondary education and higher education make up more than half, about 55%. Primary and secondary taking up about 44% of the general revenue, state source general revenue fund in 2018, and higher education about 11%. Here, Medicaid accounts for about 7%, and other health and human services about 9%. Corrections takes up 8%, about 3% goes to local governments, and all other functions, think commerce, administration, agriculture, and so forth. This is another 8% of the budget. Next slide, please. This slide shows trends in state source GRF expenditures, or how are we using our taxpayer dollars and other state generated funds over time, and it's adjusted for inflation. The line graph on the left side of the slide shows that adjusted for inflation, state GRF expenditures are lower than in 2000, although the economy and the population have grown. The share of the budget taken up by major expenditure categories over time shows some shift as well. And this is the colorful chart on the right side. The very thick blue bar on the bottom represents K through 12 education as a share of the General Revenue Fund over time. And the next bar in orange is higher education. Medicaid is the gray bar in the middle. We do see amongst these 3 bottom bars an upward push in education and a leveling off in Medicaid going into 2018. Health and Human Services is the yellow bar above the gray Medicaid bar. It has grown smaller over time. Investment in corrections, the next bar, the sort of light blue bar, has also declined very slightly in spite of very high numbers of inmates and overcrowding of prisons. We see a sharp decline in local government funds over time, which offsets increase in other categories. And the expenditure on all other services has remained fairly steady. Next slide, please. Policy Matters Ohio watches all of the moving parts in the budget. What we focus on, as you can tell from what we've already said, we focus on certain issues. A big focus is education, which Victoria Jackson has spoken about. I'll add that Ohio has underinvested in early education. Ohio has fallen dramatically in our ranking amongst the 50 states in terms of low-income kids we send to preschool, for example. It's not that we send fewer now than we did in 2000, but that other states are investing much more heavily in early education, boosting opportunity for kids in the workforce of the future. We're very concerned about inadequate and unsustainable funding for early education and public child care. We focus very much on the earned income tax credit, as Kalitha explained. We were the first group to be out with policy analysis supporting the Medicaid expansion, and we work hard to fend off threats to healthcare, like new eligibility requirements called work requirements, which will reduce access to healthcare. We work on protective services, adult protective services in particular. We track spending on the drug epidemic, and we advocate for funding to better address this growing public health crisis. Policy Matters Ohio has been a leading voice in identifying huge cuts to local governments, including local health and human service levies and public transit, which loses $40 million a year starting in 2019 as a result of a tax break that the state gave to managed care companies. We are taking a hard look at corrections and reentry and policies needed to change the system so that it is more fair, rehabilitative, and reprioritize spending to move people back to productivity. We believe there are many investments the state should make to restore our communities, build opportunity, and boost the economy. We also make clear how we would recommend paying for such investments, and that takes us to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you so much, Wendy. All you needed to know about Ohio spending in 10 minutes or less. And so, I mean, obviously, in saying that, I'm making clear that Wendy's knowledge of this area, far exceeds what she could convey to you today. So I would love to see questions in the chat box about any aspect of state spending, why we're spending less on childcare than other states, why we're spending less on higher ed, why the budget looks the way it does. So go ahead and get those into the chat box. And meanwhile, Zach Schiller, who is our research director up here in our Cleveland office, is going to tell you how we're going to pay for all of the great ideas that have been presented by all the previous speakers.
Okay, thanks, Amy, and glad to be here with you today. As Wendy has said, of course, our state tax system is how we pay for meeting these needs. And unfortunately, Ohio has cut taxes significantly. Since 2005, the General Assembly has cut state income tax rates by 1/3, created a huge new income tax exemption for business income, eliminated our corporate profits tax, repealed a major local business property tax on machinery, equipment, and inventory, and jettisoned the estate tax. To pay for part of this, it has increased the sales tax, boosted the cigarette tax, and created a new business tax on gross receipts called the commercial activity tax. Enough to make your head spin, I know. The advent of casinos and racinos also has led to taxes on those activities. But the net is a reduction in revenue of $6 billion a year. And to put that into perspective, our overall state tax revenue is about $23 billion a year. These tax cuts, as the graph on the left shows, have not brought a stronger Ohio economy. We have lagged behind the nation in job growth as well as in other measures. The tax cuts also, as the graph on the right shows, have gone primarily to affluent Ohioans. The top 1% who make more than $480,000 a year received an average annual tax cut of $40,000 from the major tax changes between 2005 and now. On average, Ohioans in the bottom 20% of the income spectrum making $22,000 or less on average are paying $140 more, while those in the middle 20% have basically broken even. This added to the existing tilt of Ohio's state and local tax system in favor of the wealthy. Next slide, please. This slide shows basically who pays in Ohio for our state and local taxes. And what it shows is that our state and local tax system is slanted in favor of the most affluent. This shows basically how much each income group is paying as a share of income. Taxpayers in the bottom 20% pay nearly twice as much as those in the top 1%, 11.9 versus 6.1%. You can also see from this slide the importance of the income tax, which is the navy blue portion at the bottom of each bar. That is the only major state tax based on the ability to pay, and it needs to be strengthened, not reduced. We have a graduated tax, which means that everyone pays the same rate on the same income. As your income increases, you move into a higher bracket and pay more on only that income. Bolstering the income tax is a key element of generating the necessary revenue to make the investments we need for a strong economy and a healthy Ohio. Next slide, please. The biggest element of the recent tax changes, first created in 2013, was a new tax break for owners of S corporations, limited liabilities, and other businesses that is now costing well over $1 billion a year. It eliminates the income tax on business income up to $250,000 a year and reduces the rate on such income over that amount. As the two graphs in this slide show, this LLC loophole has not brought an increase in either the growth of small businesses, which is shown on the left, or in their hiring of new businesses, new employees for the very first time, which is captured in the graph on the right. It discriminates against wage earners. Someone making $50,000 as an employee will pay more than $1,100 in Ohio income tax, but if they hang out a shingle and call themselves an independent contractor, they will pay nothing. Most of those who receive this break receive far too little to hire anyone, yet it also goes to partners in law firms and passive owners of businesses. In Kansas, the legislature repealed a similar break because of the effect it had on their budget and the unfairness of it. Ohio needs to do the same. Next slide, please. This is part of a proposal that Policy Matters Ohio has put forward to overhaul and strengthen our income tax. Besides getting rid of this giant LLC loophole, we would raise taxes on the most affluent and strengthen the earned income tax credit, as Kalitha has described. Our plan would raise about $2.6 billion a year, including this stronger EITC. This could support major investments in preschool, free community college for very low-income students, fully funding the state recommendations for aiding public transit, and major additional aid for K-12 education and local governments. Nearly 3/4 of that would be paid by the top 1%, who average more than $1 million a year. Overall, more than 70% of Ohioans would see no change in their taxes, while about 1 in 6 would see a tax cut because of the stronger earned income tax credit. Hardly any taxpayers in the bottom 60% would see a tax increase under our plan, and on average, they would see modest tax cuts. Even the most affluent, on average, would still be getting an average tax cut of more than $2,000 a year versus 2005, before a lot of these tax cuts kicked in. And that doesn't include the huge cuts that this group is getting in federal taxes. We've focused here on the income tax as the center of needed tax reform in Ohio. We need other changes in our tax system too. For example, limitation of some of the other 128 tax breaks in addition to the LLC loophole, which as of now are getting only superficial examination. We hope to share initial news on that soon, so watch for our website on that. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. So I've seen a lot of really good questions trickling in, and if people have questions on budgets or on taxes, please go ahead and put those into the chat box. And there are some complicated tax and budget questions, so I'm going to start with some of the slightly more simple questions. And I think I will start with the question that came into Victoria, which is someone said that she is interested in finding more fair and constitutional funding for public schools, Victoria, and she's wondering if you've researched other funding options in other areas to see what's working elsewhere and what you've discovered from that, and whether there are better ways for more fairly sharing public school funds. Do you have anything you want to say to that?
Oh, yes, thank you for the question. Just to provide a little background, as I'm sure most of you know, Ohio school funding has been deemed unconstitutional for times. The legislature has not fully dealt with that issue, but what they've done is sort of have on our state funding system, make it slightly where it directs more resources to low wealth, low income districts. But when we combine state and local funding together, high wealth districts are still spending more than low wealth districts. So there are some things that we can do within our funding formula to sort of shift more money and resources to low wealth districts to have equitable funding. So things that I mentioned, like increasing the per pupil amounts and then increasing the weights and the money we put towards like things that are called like targeted aid and capacity aid, which directly go to low income districts, and also things for English language learners, low income students, and students with disabilities. We can direct more money to those students specifically in the schools that educate them, and that's one of the ways that we can have more equitable funding. So the students who need more resources are getting more resources. New Jersey is a state that does this better than we do. they allocate significantly more money than we do to low-income students, English language learners, and students with disabilities. And please feel free to reach out to me via email or phone, and we can talk about this further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. I appreciate that explanation. Another question that came in is really directed toward Hannah. And we're wondering, Hannah, if you have information on how many people are working multiple part-time jobs.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There is data on this. There's a national survey that had that number of part-time or multiple job holders around 5%. But there's some real reasons to be skeptical of this number. One, the survey is conducted by phone and you have to contact the respondents multiple times over time. And so low-wage job holders, the folks that I think we would be kind of concerned about in that category, are not likely to be picked up in that survey. They're likely to be underrepresented. There's also questions about people responding upfront and honestly about that question. A lot of folks may be holding multiple jobs, but maybe one of those are paid under the table and they're reluctant to tell the federal government that. And then some folks don't even see themselves as multiple job holders if they have one job they're getting a paycheck for, but the other job is kind of a gig or something they're doing on the side that's largely self-employed. They may not even answer yes to that question. So lots of researchers feel that that is very, very likely an underreporting of the number of multiple job holders. There's a different data set. It's the alternative measures of labor underutilization. This is part of where our unemployment rate comes from. But there's another rate included in that data set called the U6. And that is our broadest sort of look at the unemployment rate. That includes people that are part-time workers for economic reasons, meaning they would have full-time jobs if they could find them and get hired into them. And it also looks at marginally attached workers. So those are folks that could work, that have worked at some point in the last 12 months, but have kind of given up looking. So it wouldn't include all of the discouraged folks, but it would include a broader swath, much more than what our official unemployment rate captures. Now that number in Ohio for 2017 was 9.2%. That's higher than the national rate, and it had only declined by 0.5% from 2016. So there's still lots of folks that fall into those categories in the state. Now, the thing with this is that even if folks were working, the wages that they would likely be working for don't appear to be the kind of wages that are going to move their family ahead. And so job growth is only part of this solution from our perspective. We've had some job growth. It's been slow. It's been largely regional. There's some issues with that. But we also need to start looking at policies to directly impact job quality and to really look at this question of rebalancing marketplace power between labor and employers. So that's a very long yes. And feel free to contact me if you want to dive into any of that or want some links to those surveys.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. I definitely appreciate you clarifying that people who work 3 jobs might not have time to answer random calls from surveyors.
Or maybe have a house phone.
Yeah. No, so that's great information. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for both of those questions. Another question that came across was, what are the top 3 causes that are delaying reformatting the one-to-one relationship between property taxes and school funding? And I'm thinking that maybe Zach can take the first stab at that, but it's possible that Wendy or Victoria might have something to add to that.
Well, I think others may want to jump in here. To me, it's a matter of political will. We've been now 20 years since the DeRolf decision, in which the Ohio Supreme Court first deemed the system of funding unconstitutional. And while there were certain steps taken, notably investing more in school buildings, we really just haven't, and in fact, I don't really even think it's been on the table lately. Yeah. So I don't think that there are there are ways to do this, but we haven't confronted them, and lately we haven't even been looking at that. So on some level, I appreciate the question because it should be a matter that is a priority, and it just hasn't been.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything to that answer.
Yeah, no, I agree with Zach. I think it's a political will issue. We have decades of research that tells us exactly what we need to do to have equitable funding and to improve outcomes for low-income students where they even score and perform on par with high-income students, and we're just not doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for that question and those succinct answers. Another question that came in was how much nominal GRF spending is attributable to Ohio-sourced tax receipts? And I'm hoping that either Zach or Wendy
Let me take a first crack.
understands both the meaning of the question and an answer, because I'm not sure I do.
All right, well, I'll do what I can, but I think Wendy will need to assist. If the question is how much of our tax revenue is coming from Ohioans versus from people or companies outside Ohio, I've never actually seen data on that question. There clearly is a considerable amount of revenue. For instance, if you look at the commercial activity tax, it's paid by corporations located outside Ohio, but that do business, that sell products into Ohio, or the income tax some people outside Ohio pay, or certainly the sales tax. So, our major taxes do have a contribution from non-Ohioans, but I think are primarily paid by Ohioans. Now, the question of how much of our spending is attributable to Ohio-sourced tax receipts, the most recent estimate, by the budget office that just came out last month shows that they're now expecting nearly $23 billion in tax revenue to come in during this fiscal year that began July 1. And they show non-tax revenue and transfers from other sources at only about $500 million. So those are not major sources. However, that excludes the federal grants that Wendy mentioned earlier, in particular for Medicaid. And maybe Wendy has a ballpark idea of that, because that's a significant amount.
Wendy, anything you want to add there?
I would say that my go-to source for understanding Ohio sources for funding expenditures is historical Table 2 in the Ohio Legislative Service Commission's Historical Revenues and Expenditures Table. Table 2 shows state expenditures that are sourced to taxpayer dollars, lottery profits in education, and it includes local government funds, which are a share of taxpayer dollars. So Table 2 has data on Ohio-sourced, Ohio expenditures and the share of Ohio sources going to that back to 1975.
Great. And if the person who asked that question wants to follow up with an email to us, I'm sure we'd be happy to send you a link or to screenshot a page from that booklet. So thank you so much. Please feel free to ask additional questions. And another question that came in was for Hannah. So Hannah, did you really say that overtime is just you can just earn like $24,000 or $25,000 and not be eligible for overtime when you work more than 40 hours a week? Is that really how that works?
Yep, that's right. So if you're a salaried employee and you have some sort of professional, managerial, or administrative function, and you earn more than that $23,000 a year range, you are ineligible for overtime. So if you are a shift supervisor at McDonald's and you're salaried, you're working 60 hours a week, you're earning $22,000 a year, you do not get any more money for those additional hours worked, even though you have very little actual control over the terms and conditions of your job. So
is that something Ohio lawmakers can do something about?
Yeah, so Ohio is basically following the federal rule, but Ohio could have a different rule. So they could implement the $46,000 threshold so that if you are earning up to $46,000, then you would be covered by overtime protection. And that really is just restoring the value that it used to have. So we've neglected to update that figure, and over time, it's been eroded through inflation. So this was intended to protect workers who, the overtime threshold was really intended to sort of cut out those workers that had real bargaining power over the terms and conditions of their job, people with real managerial control. And because we don't update the threshold, a lot more workers are being scooped into that category that don't really belong there and that need and deserve those kinds of protections. It's straightforward. It would have a huge impact on working Ohioans. You saw on the slide more than 300,000 folks would benefit. It's just one of those things that it doesn't make sense that we've not already done.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And Kalitha, another question that I had, I mean, the earned income tax credit is something that came up throughout several people's presentations. But could you just explain really simply, like, why is that such a good anti-poverty tool? And what could Ohio do to strengthen its own earned income tax credit?
Sure. So there are quite a few great things about the credit. First, it targets low-income working families. It targets them and is actually rewarding their work and helps families who are working to get ahead. As stated before, many other states have EITCs, but unfortunately, Ohio's is non-refundable. It's very low. Our credit is at 10%, and the average credit is higher than that. And we also have a flaw in our credit that actually limits the impact it has on people who can claim it. Federally, the credit is refundable. We know that in Ohio, close to 1 million people are already claiming it. And we see that people use the credit to make purchases and take care of their basic needs that they're not able to do already. And these purchases help boost local economies in local communities. So the benefit to the credit is not only just to the family, but also to our economies in Ohio. It's a credit that, in Ohio, our credit is non-refundable, and really just through legislation, legislators could make our credit refundable, and we would join the majority of states in the nation that have it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kalitha. And there is a report on our website about how lawmakers could make the credit refundable. It's also in the bigger tax report that Zach described. The very last question is just for Zach Schiller. Did you say that we're losing $1 billion a year just from one big tax loophole that Kansas repealed? And can you just say just a little bit more and like, why did Kansas repeal it? And why are we expanding ours when Kansas is repealing theirs?
Well, Kansas, as you may know, is not seen generally as an incredibly liberal state. But what they experienced was they passed a complete elimination of their income tax on this kind of business income, which is the income that business owners who own various so-called pass-through businesses, because their income is taxed when it passes through to them. They passed that as a part of a set of tax cuts, and it wreaked havoc on the Kansas budget to the point that their schools weren't sufficiently funded. And so as a result, lawmakers of both parties pretty much united on this and overturned that. They, in fact, overrode a veto of the then Governor Sam Brownback in both houses of the Kansas legislature in order to repeal it. The tax break here in Ohio isn't quite as extensive, but it's still gigantic. It's become almost overnight the second largest tax break in the Ohio tax code. And it is worth well over $1 billion a year. There was a certain amount of, back about a little over a year ago, when legislators were in the last stages of considering how to finish off our current 2-year budget, they suddenly realized that, oh, gee, this is indeed costing us $1 billion a year, at the same moment as it appeared that we would need to make up $1 billion a year in our budget. Regrettably, they did not take action to reduce or eliminate that tax break, but it is indeed that big, and it shows it goes primarily to the very wealthiest Ohioans, even while it is also scattered across hundreds and hundreds of thousands of business owners. And so I've often likened it to flying an airplane over the state and throwing cash over the side, because the amount that most of the business owners receive is in the hundreds of dollars, so it isn't enough for them to hire certainly a full-time or permanent employee, and yet it costs a great deal to the state. So it's sort of the worst of all possible worlds. We're spending a fortune on it. As the data I've shown earlier described, it hasn't improved the economy. And meanwhile, we have all of these important investments, some of which you've heard about and others of which we detail in our research, that we're not making. And so getting rid of it, I think, should be job one for the next legislature.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much to the legislators and candidates who joined this call. We're really, really grateful for your interest, both in running for office and in learning about the research that we've done. You can find all of our research on our website at policymattersohio.org, or in the over 1,000 press hits that we get each year kind of chronicling the research that we've done. Feel free to email any of us at any time. The Columbus folks are happy to stop by your office or have you stop by there. And we're really grateful for your interest in making Ohio a better place to live.